Hi, everyone, and welcome to Liberty.me Live. We're here tonight with Sheldon.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Matt. Nice to be back. This is a monthly affair now, so I hope we'll have a good attendance of regulars and then maybe people drifting in and out. But I hope I have a good core of regulars. So I want to talk about the libertarian anti-militarist tradition. I'm going to use classical liberal and libertarian fairly interchangeably. That's not exactly technically correct. I think we can draw some distinctions, but that's not that would be beyond my purpose tonight. So I'll use them interchangeably, especially when I'm speaking about some of our predecessors. Uh, just as a quick introduction, I wanted to say that a non-interventionist foreign policy, it seems pretty obvious to me, is the natural complement to a non-interventionist domestic policy. We can see that government is uniquely threatening to liberty and that this threat warrants keeping the state on as short a leash in the international arena as in the domestic arena. Shorter, in fact, because foreign policy uh, will inevitably be conducted covertly if the government is given leeway. By the way, I'm not going to get into the minarchist anarchist debate. I think this holds regardless of what position you take on that. So I don't want to get into that. That would take us, I think, too far afield. So one of our predecessors, the classical liberal and libertarian William Graham Sumner, was one of the founders of sociology, professor at Yale, lived from 1840 to 1910, made his mark as a great anti-imperialist classical liberal, laissez-faire advocate, anti-war. He opposed the Spanish-American War. He was a member of the Anti-Imperialist League. And he noted that intervention translates to, as he put it, quote, war, debt, taxation, diplomacy, a grand governmental system, pomp, glory, a big army and navy, lavish expenditures, and political jobbery. And he might have included in his list conscription. Uh, maybe we didn't have conscription at that point, so we'll forgive him for leaving that out. So this in itself constitutes a daunting domestic case against military intervention. In other words, it has domestic implications. Uh, there's a great paper to take this a step further, a great paper in the current issue of the Independent Review, fall 2014, by Christopher Coyne and Abigail Hull, that argues powerfully that US government policies and technologies developed to efficiently carry out the occupation of foreign societies eventually boomerang, that's their term, boomerang back on Americans at home. And I refer you to that paper for details, but the surveillance techniques and the skills, the person, as they put it, the human capital and the physical capital required to carry out surveillance, to put down insurgencies, uh, are first developed in foreign societies and then find their way home uh, through various channels. As the late Chalmers Johnson, who was a great critic of the American empire, used to say, we either dismantle the empire or we live under it. And the Coyne Hull paper shows us how this happens. So that's the domestic side. On the foreign side, intervention and the war and occupation it is prone to engender immorally threatens non-combatants, vital infrastructure that people's lives depend on, and social institutions, sowing the seeds of despotism and human disaster in the country that's attacked, that's occupied. So there is this at the core of libertarianism, a non-interventionism in foreign policy. Uh, not all libertarians have seen this point, and you find some libertarians who are ambivalent about this, and they start with this idea that, well, in the name of national defense, the government or maybe ought to be able to do things in foreign countries. We may not like them, but it still comes under the rubric of national defense. And foreign intervention, of course, is often defended in terms of national defense. If you think of George Bush's invasion of Iraq in the whole WMD bit was related directly to the Americans' security. That's the way it was explained to us, that this was a danger to us. Only when they didn't find WMD did they begin to say, well, we freed the Iraqi people from this vicious dictator and they'll be better off. But that was not the primary appeal. If they had only gone to the people and said, we're going to do this to free the Iraqis, I don't think you would have seen the public support. And I think the policymakers understood that. But we can argue, and I think current history, recent history has illustrated this very well, that in fact foreign intervention doesn't serve or foster the defense of the American people, but rather endangers the American people. It's known as blowback, where you make people angry overseas and then they seek vengeance. And it ends up with things like 9/11. So I want to focus on one of my favorite classical liberals and libertarians, namely Herbert Spencer. So we libertarians need to reacquaint ourselves with this intellectual heritage, given the times we live in. We've been through more than a decade of war in Iraq and then Afghanistan. And of course, there's lower level wars in Yemen and Somalia, and there are covert wars going on. I'm sure that we haven't even heard about yet. Drone warfare in different places, Pakistan. There's not even any kind of formal war, no congressional authorization. And so this is a great time for libertarians to reacquaint ourselves with this heritage, which I believe, as I said earlier, relates to this core point within the libertarian philosophy against foreign intervention, against empire, against occupation, uh, basically a policy of non-intervention, sometimes mistakenly called isolationism. But I think you know the problems with that term because it seems to imply a total cutting off from the rest of the world. But as laissez-faire advocates, as free trade advocates, it's not that we don't want to cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. We just want to cut the U.S. military off from the rest of the world. So the heritage I'm referring to is too often overlooked and maybe not even appreciated at all because of ignorance about it. Libertarianism, to say the least, is deeply skeptical of state power, and it follows that libertarianism must be skeptical of the state's power to make war, to kill and destroy in other lands. Along with its domestic police authority, this, of course, is the state's most dangerous power. And I note in passing that in 1901, a libertarian by the name of Frenchman by the name of Frederick Passy, who was a friend of Gustave de Molinari, a libertarian economist of the 19th century in France, shared in the first Nobel Peace Prize along with the International Red Cross. So I think that's something we can be proud of. The Peace Prize has gone downhill in years since. If you go back and look at who has won it, but we can take some pride that the first winner was Frederick Passy, who was a laissez-faire advocate and one of the French radical liberals that we think of when we think of Spencer and sorry, not Spencer, but Frederick Bastiat and J.B. Say and people like that. So let me turn to Spencer, whose dates are 1820 to 1903. I pick him because he just had a great way of putting things, and he really captured what I think is the libertarian spirit, the spirit. Now, he was the great English libertarian philosopher of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. He eloquently expressed radical liberalism's antipathy to war and militarism as a counterpart, again, to his domestic laissez-faire. His writings are full of warnings about the dangers of war and conquest. Young Spencer saw and cheered the rise of what he called the industrial type of society, which was displacing the counterpart that he called the militant type. The industrial type was founded on equal freedom, consent, and contract. The militant on hierarchy, command, and force. Yet Spencer lived long enough to see a reversal, and in his later writings lamented the ascendancy of the old militant traits. We have a good deal to learn from the much maligned Spencer, who is inexplicably condemned as favoring the law of the jungle and other horrible sounding things. This is so laughably opposite of the truth that one couldn't be blamed for concluding that the calumny is the product of bad faith and not just misunderstanding of Spencer. As Auburn University philosopher Roderick Long writes about Spencer, the textbook summary is absurd, of course. Far from being a proponent of might makes right, Spencer wrote that the, quote, desire to command is essentially a barbarous desire, close quote, because it, quote, implies an appeal to force, which is inconsistent with the first law of morality and radically wrong, close quote. While Spencer opposed tax-funded welfare programs, he strongly supported voluntary charity and indeed devoted 10 chapters of his Principle of Ethics to a discussion of the duty of what he called positive beneficence. Okay, so Spencer jumped on the issues of war and peace right out of the gate. His first book, Social Statics, published in 1851, contains a chapter called Government Colonization that examines the effects of imperialism on both the home and subjugated populations. While formal colonization has gone out of style in our time, many of its key characteristics have been preserved in a new form. Thus, Spencer's observations are entirely pertinent in our day. He starts by pointing out that the parent country's government must violate the rights of its own citizens when it engages in colonial conquest and rule. Spencer advocated just enough government to protect the freedom of the citizens who live under it. Although I should add that the first edition of Social Statics included a great chapter called The Right to Ignore the State, which he removed from later editions. Unfortunately, I might add. He claims that the money spent on colonies is necessarily is money not needed to protect that freedom. So he writes, quote, a government cannot undertake to administer the affairs of a colony and to support for it a judicial staff, a constabulary, a garrison, and so forth, without trespassing against the parent society. In other words, this point needs scarcely pointing out, he says. Any expenditure for these purposes, be it like our own, some 3.5 million sterling a year, or but a few thousands, involve a breach of state duty, the taking from men property beyond what is needful for better securing of their rights. We have seen to be an infringement of their rights. Colonial expenditure cannot be met without property being so taken. Colonial expenditure is therefore unjustifiable. So here he's arguing from a minarchist, a limited government position, saying if the purpose of government is the protection of the society that it governs, then if it's spending money to administer colonies, that by definition is money that's being taken not for the purposes of protecting the home society, but for some other purpose, and therefore is unjustifiable. Spencer proceeds to demolish the argument that foreign acquisitions increase the wealth of the parent society, which is often argued, as though such acquisitions are analogous to voluntary trade relations. He writes, quote, experience is fast teaching us that distant dependencies are burdens and not acquisitions. And thus, this earliest motive for state colonization, the craving for wider possessions, will very soon be destroyed by the conviction that territorial aggression is as impolitic as it is unjust. Close quote. Any true economic benefits from dealing with foreign populations can be obtained through free trade, he says, rather than conquest. He invokes the law of comparative advantage to argue that the parent society loses, not gains, when the government coercively creates artificial foreign markets for products the society can't produce as efficiently as others can. I'm sure you're all familiar with the law of comparative advantage, which says it's better to specialize in what you're best at, even if it's only a comparative advantage, not an absolute advantage, and trade your surplus product with other people, and that way everybody gets more. So you're getting more for less effort. For those on the receiving end of, so that's the argument on the domestic side, how it hurts the home society. As for those on the receiving end of colonial policy, Spencer was blunt. Quote, "We meet nothing but evil results. It is prettily sounding, it is a prettily sounding expression, that of mother country protection, but a very delusive one. If we are to believe those who have known the thing rather than the name, there is but little of the maternal about it. While the worst practices," he adds, "were less common in his time than previously, quote, kindred iniquities are continued." He continues, "We have but to glance over the newspapers published in our foreign possessions to see that the arbitrary rule of the colonial office is no blessing. Chronic irritation, varying in intensity from that of which petitions are symptomatic to that exhibited in open rebellions, is habitually presented in these 46 scattered dependencies which statesmen have encumbered us with." He condemns what he calls the pitiless taxation that wrings from poor peasants and tenant farmers nearly half the produce of the soil, and the cunning despotism which uses native soldiers to maintain and extend native subjection. A despotism under which, not many years since, a regiment of Indian soldiers under British command was deliberately massacred for refusing to march without proper clothing. He goes on, "Down to our own day, the police authorities league with wealthy scamps and allow the machinery of the law to be used for purposes of extortion. Down to our own day, so-called gentlemen will ride their elephants through the crops of impoverished peasants and will supply themselves with provisions from the native villages without paying for them. And down to our own day, it is common with the people in the interior to run into the woods at the sight of a European." He wonders, is it not then sufficiently clear that this state colonization is as indefensible on the score of colonial welfare as on that of home interests? May we not reasonably doubt the propriety of people on one side of the earth being governed by officials on the other? Would not these transplanted societies probably manage their affairs better than we can do it for them? No one can fail to see that these cruelties, these treacheries, these deeds of blood and rapine, for which European nations in general have to blush, are mainly due to the carrying on of colonization under state management with the help of state funds and state force. Spencer was keenly aware that such criticism of the government was regarded as unpatriotic. In 1902, near the end of his life, he turned his attention to that charge. In an essay titled "Patriotism," included in his collection called "Facts and Comments," he begins, quote, "Were anyone to call me dishonest or untruthful, he would touch me to the quick. Were he to say I am unpatriotic, he would leave me unmoved." England may have done things in the past to advance freedom, Spencer says, but, quote, "there are traits, unhappily of late more frequently displayed, which do the reverse." And then he goes on. Contemplation of the acts by which England has acquired over 80 possessions, settlements, colonies, protectorates, etc., does not arouse feelings of satisfaction. The transitions from missionaries to resident agents, then to officials having armed forces, then to punishments of those who resist their rule, ending in so-called pacification. These processes of annexation, now gradual, now sudden, as that of the new Indian province and that of Baratza land, which was declared a British colony with no more regard for the wills of the inhabiting people than for those of the inhabiting beasts, do not excite sympathy with their perpetrators. If because my love of country does not survive these and many other adverse experiences, I am called unpatriotic, well, I am content to be so called. To me, he says, the cry, "our country right or wrong," seems detestable. Spencer gave no ground on this matter, which he made obvious with a story he relates toward the end of his essay. Quote, some years ago, I gave my expression to my own feeling, anti-patriotic feeling, it will doubtless be called, in a somewhat startling way. It was at the time of the Second Afghan War, when, in pursuance of what were thought to be, quote, our interests, close quote, we were invading Afghanistan. News had come that some of our troops were in danger. At the Athenaeum Club, a well-known military man, then a captain, but now a general, drew my attention to a telegram containing this news and read it to me in a manner implying the belief that I should share his anxiety. I astounded him by replying, when men hire themselves out to shoot other men to order, asking nothing about the injustice of their cause, I don't care if they are shot themselves. Spencer was second to none in his anti-militarism and anti-imperialism. That is, in his love of universal individual liberty and voluntary social cooperation. With heads held high, libertarians can claim him as one of their own. And we can also claim non-interventionism as a core principle of our belief in freedom. So I will stop there and gladly open up to conversation and questions. I hope that was provocative enough.
Thank you, Sheldon. Why is it, do you think, that that Herbert Spencer has been so demonized by the left?
Well, Roderick Long could probably give you a better answer because I'm not an expert on the critiques of Spencer as he is. I think he considers himself a one-man Spencer Anti-Defamation League. I think one reason he's despised is because he's such an uncompromising advocate of laissez-faire. And so the best way to malign someone like that is to talk about the law of the jungle, dog eat dog, and social Darwinism, which is really odd because he preceded Darwin. In fact, he influenced Darwin. So he's not a social Darwinist. I guess we could say that Darwin was a biological Spencerian. I mean, he did believe in social evolution, but he didn't take this view from Darwin. And as we know now from the quote from Roderick, he was not an opponent of charity. He believed in charity; thought it was a very good thing. He was just an opponent of state-enforced, welfare and transfer programs. But the other side has always been very happy to smear that position as, if you're against state welfare, then you must be against charity and just want to see the poor die along the wayside. Bastiat addressed that, that phenomenon in the law, I think it is, where he says, if you say you're against state education, that's interpreted as you're against education. So it's just the same old story.
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
Right. Right. Of course, he didn't mean, as again, going back to the quote from Roderick, where he attacked ruling other people. He called that barbaric. And if you look at his description of the two kinds of societies, the militant and the industrial, it's very clear that he didn't mean survival in the sense of, fall by the wayside if you're weak and poor. We don't want you. It's that people will adapt to the prevailing conditions, and that's what he meant by survival, prospering, and fit meant being adapted to the prevailing conditions. So and that would be different in a society of contract rather versus a society of status. Well, I don't know about less well known, but the first names that come to mind are well known. We already mentioned Bastiat. Bastiat was, not just an advocate of laissez-faire and free trade, but he understood the connection between free trade and peace. and he was actually an advocate of unilateral French disarmament. And that's it. You can find that in a book by Edmund Silberner called I think it's called The Idea of Peace in 19th Century um, Economics. And by that he was referring to those classical liberal laissez-faire advocates who were pro-peace. They thought war and colonization, conquest was bad for the home society as much as it was for the conquered society. And then across the channel, of course, we find Richard Cobden and John Bright, who, of course, are famous for having started the Anti-Corn Law League in defense of free trade and an end to tariffs on grain, which was a favor to the landed aristocracy in England, but was hard on the working people and anyone else who needed to buy grain. But they very explicitly tied the free trade cause to the peace cause, and both of them made many speeches. They were in the parliament for a while, made many speeches in favor of non-intervention, and they used that term. They favored arbitration when two governments had a conflict. He thought there should be some arbitration process that would avert war, and generally he was opposed to England trying to manage the balance of power on the continent. So you can find their speeches on the internet. The Liberty Fund's internet, what is it called? The Library of Liberty has almost all their political writings and parliamentary speeches. So you can find some very inspiring things there. They knew a lot of history. They tied history in to England's policy to show what a fraud it was, that it wasn't good for the English people and it wasn't good for the people that were getting intervened against. So just about any classical liberal you can name is going to be good on this issue. I can't really think of anyone back then who was bad on the issue. One strange case is Benjamin Tucker, the individual's American anarchist, who just didn't say anything about foreign policy, at least that I'm not aware of. And I've talked to other people who have read a lot of Tucker, and so he wasn't saying much about foreign policy at all. And and I guess maybe I'm giving him even too much credit, because when World War I came along, he was getting old, but when he was actually in pro-ally, he took sides in World War I. He was, I think, living in France, and that might have had something to do with his decision. So he's an anomaly, though. The others, I mean, Spooner was an abolitionist, Lysander Spooner, but opposed the Union's war on the South, even though he was totally against slavery. In fact, he tried to foment slave revolts in the South. He would sneak into the South and put up posters on trees trying to get the slaves to revolt. But he thought it was a terrible thing for the Union, for Lincoln to mount an army and invade the South. He thought that was not a way to get what he wanted. Well, I think Pearl Harbor was probably the big reason. I mean, the American First Committee dissolved after Pearl Harbor, and I don't know the exact reason, whether they thought you can't not respond when something like that happens, uh, or it would just, the public support just would not be there. So why keep talking about it at that point? It was something like that. Uh, but I should point out that some key members of the old right, I'm thinking of John T. Flynn and other people I'll name as I think of them, opposed the Cold War after World War II. And William Henry Chamberlain, or I guess he became more of a Cold Warrior. He was certainly against both World War I and World War II, U.S. entry. But there were a few of those old guys, and even Robert Taft was a skeptic about the Cold War. He thought the U.S. was encircling Russia, provoking Russia, that Russia wasn't really a threat to Western Europe. It was exhausted after the war. That was not his intention. Was not to Stalin's intention was not to rule, and it was beyond his capabilities to rule Western Europe. So there were alt-right voices that resisted. Flynn opposed the early intervention in Korea, but also opposed the Vietnam War. When the U.S. first started getting involved in the Vietnam War after 1954, I mean, long before it became a major U.S. operation. So there were some honorable people. Some of them did, it's true, go over and decide that the Cold War was necessary. Yeah, great book. I recommend it. As long as we're mentioning things, the sad news, of course, of last week was that Leonard Liggio died at 81. He lived a long, active life, but still too soon, died too soon for the sake of the movement and all who loved him. He wrote a very good book review in 1964 or 5 that you can find at the Mises Institute. It was published originally in a publication that he and Mary Rothbard edited briefly called Left and Right. And it was a review of a new left book by Sidney Lenz, Lens, called The Feudal Crusade, Anti-Communism as American Credo. And this extended review essay by Liggio is called Why the Feudal Crusade? And I highly recommend that. You can find that and download a PDF of it and read it. It's really worth it. It's not just a review of the book in typical Liggio fashion. He knew so much history, and he brings so much to this review. He'll tell you about Robert Taft and other critics of the Cold War. You'll learn a heck of a lot. I highly recommend that review. Sure. Very happy to. Thanks for asking. I wrote a bit of a recollection about him last Friday in my TGIF column, which you can find at the Future Freedom Foundation, fff.org. Excuse me a second. And I first met Leonard. I'm a little fuzzy when I first met him. I think I might have met him in San Francisco in 1977. I'd gone out to the Libertarian Party convention, which was in San Francisco, and the Cato Institute was just opening. That was the year it opened and started in San Francisco. I don't know how many people know that. It moved to Washington in 1980, early 81. And so I visited and might well have met him there. But my real acquaintance with him began a year later when I attended the first Cato summer seminar. They used to do summer seminars on college campuses. They did two a year, one in the East and one in the West. In 1978, the very first one was held at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. And I was a newspaper reporter at the time, and but wanting to get into the movement professionally. So I really had that on my mind. And so I went to the seminar. It was a wonderful seminar. Mary Rothbard lectured, Bill Evers, of course, Leonard, Arthur E. Kirch, a great classical liberal historian, wrote so much good stuff, Walter Grinder. And so Leonard talked about American Western imperialism, going far back. I mean, he's very capable of going to the dawn of history and bringing something up to date within a very efficient way. I mean, he was a walking encyclopedia. He's one of those amazing people. You don't know how he does it. He just absorbed so much, read so much, remembered so much, and integrated so much knowledge. So he gave a great series of lectures. It really was eye-opening about the history of imperialism and what England and France and other countries did in Africa and Asia, the horrors, the mistreatment, the economic exploitation. It made a huge impact on me. The other thing that made an impact on me from that point on, that week and then onward, was his personal manner. He was a very quiet, soft-spoken guy. He was sort of a quiet radical. He didn't rant and rave. There was not a bit of shrillness about him. And he always had a way of finding common ground with whoever he was talking to. So he got along well with everyone. As I put it in my piece, he could speak and deal with new left types in the 60s, and he did. He co-edited publications and worked with them. And then a little later on, he'd be welcome to speak at the Heritage Foundation or the Philadelphia Society, which are old conservative organizations. And I always thought of him as sort of a mystery man that different people claimed him as their ally. But I knew that he was a radical libertarian. After all, he was a friend early on of Murray Rothbard's and Ralph Raico and Ronald Hamaway and that little group that they called the Circle Bastiat, these young men from around New York who knew Ayn Rand and attended Mises' private seminar at NYU. And so they were as radical as you can get, anarchists, and yet they could talk to other people because they would find that common ground. I mean, most people have at least some sense of respecting human dignity and freedom. I mean, there are very few people who are against all freedom. So they would build on that. I mean, Leonard could find that common ground and then build on that. So I got to know Leonard well over the years. I saw him at another at IHS conference in 1981 in Lewiston, Maine, Bates College, and get to spend a week with him, talking to him and listening to his lectures. And then I worked for several libertarian organizations, but then I really got to work with him beginning in 1985, and I went to work for the Institute for Humane Studies, which had just moved to George Mason University from California. So I was there the day the moving vans rolled in, and Leonard was I forget exactly what his title is. John Blundell was the president at the time, who unfortunately he died this year also. We lost two really great libertarian activists and organizers and movement people this year. So I got to see Leonard, except when he was traveling. I saw him day by day and got to chat with him. One thing I learned is you always have to have a notebook with you when you were talking to him, especially if you asked him, what should I read on the subject X? What's good to read? What should I start with? Well, you're not going to remember it. He's a walking bibliography as well as a walking encyclopedia. So you better be taking notes because he's going to reel off books and not just reel off the names. He'll tell you about the books. He'll tell you about the authors. He was an amazing person. Read his stuff. You know, he wasn't primarily known as a writer. He didn't have the greatest output of libertarians you could name. He didn't write a book. He edited one or two books, but he wrote lots of essays earlier on. I published them in the Freeman, and so you can find some later stuff. But most of his stuff was in the 60s, the 70s, and say into the 80s. And a lot of it is at the Mises Institute because it was in Rothbard publications like the Libertarian Forum, Left and Right, and the Journal of Libertarian Studies. He wrote a lot about libertarian class theory, class conflict theory, which was originated by these early French radicals I was referring to, but in particular two I didn't mention, Charles Comte, not to be confused with Auguste Comte, same last name though, and Charles Dunoyer. And if you look up Liggio and put in the name Dunoyer, which is Dunoyer, it will take you to a paper that he published in the Journal of Libertarian Studies in probably the 70s or very early 80s on the class conflict thinking of these guys. So if you read Liggio, you are going to learn a lot. So I certainly recommend it. It's true, and I don't know how much there really is of the new left. I mean, there's still some figures like that. You know, one thing that's been said about some of the new left is once they got their university appointments, they became kind of very conservative, and have even been behind suppression of speech on campuses. So they kind of lost their way. Some may still be around, but I think it's part of the general phenomenon. You know, since Obama got into office, the question is what happened to the peace movement? What happened to the anti-war movement? People that were so hard on Bush have given Obama a pass for the same kinds of things. So that may have something to do with it. So I don't have a real answer to that. Someone maybe needs to do a study of that. There were certainly strong links between Leonard Liggio and Rothbard and others with some important figures in the New Left. Carl Oglesby, and in fact, you know, he and Rothbard, I think, co-edited some things, and Rothbard co-edited a book on the history of a new history of Leviathan with a former New Leftist who's now a neoconservative, Ronald Radosh. So he's gone over to the dark side. And of course, Rothbard himself, I mean, let's be frank, Rothbard himself became fed up with the New Left, some of it for good reason maybe, and ended up, in the camp of with Pat Buchanan and people we call paleoconservatives who are not with us on a lot of things like immigration and even free trade. So, people get older sometimes and they drift in ways we may not fully understand. Yeah, I can see why. Well, there are people who have that same ability to absorb a lot of historical knowledge and integrate it with economics, sound economics, Austrian economics. I think of David Hart at Liberty Fund. He's a wealth of information about history. He also knows a lot about those early French libertarians. Uh, who else would fit into that? I have to give that a little more thought. I mean, it's hard. I mean, Leonard really was one of a kind, so I don't easily come up with someone who is exactly like him. I mean, there are people who have uh, various of his abilities, but I don't know if I can come up with someone who had all of his abilities. That's what made him so remarkable. It's his ability to be able to spread the word, teach people in such an unthreatening way that people didn't go running from him saying, "Oh, libertarian, I need to get out of here." He could talk to almost anybody, and there may be other people who can do that, but add to that how much he knew about history and political theory and philosophy and moral philosophy. I mean, he was really remarkable, and I'd have to think long and hard to come up with someone who kind of approaches that. My pleasure. Thank you.